Part 2. The cabin Ben left behind. By the time Alexandra Carter reached the cabin, night had swallowed the valley whole. The road to old Ben Carter's land was little more than packed dirt and stone, twisting between black pines, bare bramble, and fence posts that leaned like tired men in the dark. Mist gathered low to the ground, crawling around tree roots and drifting over the road in pale, restless sheets. Behind her, somewhere beyond the ridge, the Rusk farm still burned with sheriff lights, lantern flame and panic. Ahead of her waited the only place in Bryer County that had ever felt both like shelter and warning. The cabin stood at the edge of a wide clearing, built from dark logs that had endured decades of storms, heat, snow, and silence. It sat above the creek line, surrounded by 117 acres of woodland, ravine, old trails, pasture, and places Alexandra had never fully explored, even after spending half her childhood summers there. Ben had owned every inch of it. And when he died, he had left it all to her. The cabin, the land, the cellar, the truck, the weapons, the traps in the shed, the boxes of notes, the hand-drawn maps, the locked cabinets, the journals, and whatever secrets had been nailed into the walls long before Alexandra was born. He had left nothing to the rest of the Carter family. Not a tool, not a coin, not even a chair. Ben had not trusted them. Alexandra had never blamed him for that. The Carters she knew arrived when money was rumored and vanished when work was required. They called Ben mad when he was alive, then came sniffing around his property the moment he was gone. Ben had trusted blood only when blood had earned it. With Alexandra, he had never said the word trust out loud, but he had shown it in every lesson, every warning, every key he had pressed into her palm. Now she stopped the truck beside the chopping block and sat there with both hands on the wheel. Her ribs ached where the creature had thrown her into the stall wall. Her jacket was torn across the back. Claw marks ripped through the leather but not deep enough to reach skin. Luck maybe. Or maybe the thing had not meant to kill her. Not yet. That thought stayed with her. Her right hand still smelled faintly of the creature's blood, no matter how hard she had scrubbed it with water from Sheriff Hale's canteen. The sheriff had wanted her to stay at the farm. He had wanted to talk, to plan, to pretend there was a reasonable shape to what had happened in that barn. Paul Rusk had lived, though fear would follow him longer than any bruise. The official story would be a bear attack until someone found a better lie. Hale had not liked that, but he understood it. Truth could do more damage than silence when people were not ready to hear it. Alexandra had told him she needed Ben's journals. After that, Hale stopped arguing. He caught her once more at the truck before she pulled away, his face pale beneath the emergency lights. Rusk came around for a minute. Alexandra stopped with one hand on the door. Did he say what attacked him? Hale looked toward the barn, then toward the tree line. He said it was not after the sheep. Then what was it after? The sheriff swallowed. The bell, he said. He kept saying it followed the bell. Now, standing outside Ben's cabin, Alexandra looked toward the dark woods and listened. No howl came. No bell answered. That should have comforted her. It did not. She took the shotgun from the passenger seat and crossed the porch. A lantern burned beside the door, its glow catching on hanging herbs, horseshoes, bone charms, and small iron pieces tied with red thread. To anyone else, they would have looked like the strange habits of a lonely old man. To Alexandra, they looked like a language she still had not learned to read. She stepped inside and shut the door behind her. Warmth met her first. Then the smell of smoke, old leather, dried herbs, coffee grounds, and the faint trace of tobacco that seemed to live permanently inside the cabin walls. Alexandra slid the iron bolt into place and set the shotgun against the wall within reach. Not in the rack. Not tonight. The main room was exactly as Ben had left it, and not the same at all. That was the cruel trick of death. The body left, but the shape of a life remained behind, making every object feel abandoned. His worn leather chair sat near the hearth, angled toward the fire. His boots stood beneath the bench by the door, dried mud still clinging to the soles. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with books, jars, candles, tools, shells, maps, twine, and objects Ben had once told her never to touch unless she wanted 3 days of nightmares. Alexandra removed her hat, then paused with it in her hands. It was not truly hers. Not yet. The weathered brown hat had belonged to Ben. It still held the shape of him, still carried the faint scent of smoke and rain. She had found it hanging by the door after his funeral. For reasons she still could not explain, she had taken it down and put it on. At first it had felt too large, not in size but in meaning. Tonight, after the creature in the barn had spoken her name, it felt heavier than ever. Alexandra hung the hat beside Ben's old canvas coat. For one breath, the coat and hat made a shape that almost resembled him, broad shoulders, bent brim, the suggestion of a man waiting near the door to ask why she had taken so long. Her throat tightened. "Do not start," she whispered. But grief had never listened to instructions. She moved to the hearth and crouched beside the fire. The logs had burned down to red coals beneath blackened wood. She added oak first, then cedar, because Ben had always said cedar kept a cabin honest. Sparks rose as the new wood caught. Flame brightened the stones and warmed her bruised side. For a moment, she simply stared into the fire. The first time she had returned to the cabin after Ben's death, there had been no fire. That memory hit so hard the present room seemed to thin around her. It had been late autumn. Rain had followed her all the way from the city, silver and cold against the windshield. The cabin had looked smaller when she arrived, standing alone in the clearing with no smoke rising from the chimney and no lamp in the window. That was what hurt most. Not the quiet. Not the cold. Not even knowing Ben would not open the door. It was the absence of warmth. The cabin had always felt alive when he was there. Even when he was angry. Even when he sat for an hour saying nothing while sharpening a knife. Without him the place felt hollow. She remembered stepping inside. The air had been stale and flat. No fire. No coffee. No tobacco smoke curling from his pipe. No muttered curse from the back room. Only the maple table in the center of the room, and a sealed envelope resting on it. Her name had been written across the front in Ben's hard, slanted hand. Alexandra. She had not opened it right away. She had stood there dripping rain onto the floorboards, staring at that envelope as if it were a trap. In some ways it had been. The funeral 2 days later had been small. Sheriff Hale came. Paul Rusk stood at the back in a black jacket that did not fit. Mrs. Bell from the general store brought a pie no one touched. 2 distant relatives arrived late and whispered too loudly about the land until Hale turned and looked at them. After that they whispered less. Ben would have liked that. He had once told Alexandra that if more than 6 people came to his funeral, at least 3 of them would be there to make sure he was dead. She had almost laughed when she remembered it beside his grave. Almost. Instead, she stood under a black umbrella and watched dirt fall onto his coffin, feeling like the grief belonged to someone else. Then the will was read. Everything went to her. The cabin. The land. The contents. The cellar specifically named and specifically locked. No other Carter was to enter the property without Alexandra's permission. One cousin made a sound of disgust. Alexandra remembered turning her head slowly and looking at him. She said nothing. She did not need to. By then, she already had Ben's hat in her hands. The fire snapped, pulling her back. Alexandra rose and looked around the cabin. She had cleaned it since then. Repaired it. Scrubbed the floorboards. Washed the windows. Stacked fresh wood by the hearth. Her own coat now hung beside Ben's. Her boots had joined his near the door, though she had never been able to move his away. Still, the cabin belonged to him in ways paper could not transfer. Then her gaze settled on the table. And she stopped. 3 journals rested in the center of it. They had not been there when she left for the Rusk farm. Alexandra stared. The fire cracked behind her. Outside, wind brushed against the shutters. The cabin made its usual small noises, old logs settling, flame drawing air, the roof creaking as cold tightened the beams. But the journals had not been on that table. She was certain. They had been locked in the cabinet beside Ben's desk that morning. 3 large leather volumes wrapped in dark cloth and tied with cord. She had not touched them because some part of her had not been ready. Now they lay side by side on the maple table, placed there with care. Alexandra reached toward the shotgun by instinct, then stopped herself halfway. The door was bolted. The windows were warded. The cabin felt empty. No, not empty. Watchful. Expectant. She moved toward the table. The journals were large and heavy, bound in dark brown leather worn nearly black at the corners. Each cover was scarred from years of use. One had a pale slash across it, as if a blade or claw had dragged over the surface without cutting through. Another bore a darker stain she did not want to identify too quickly as blood. Brass corner guards protected the edges, tarnished green in places. Thick stitching reinforced the spines. Each journal closed with a strap and buckle. Not locked. Only waiting. At the bottom corner of each cover, Ben's initials had been engraved. BC. Beneath them, in smaller letters, the leather carried the full name. Ben Carter. Alexandra stood over them with her hands at her sides. The first journal looked oldest. The second seemed darker and heavier, with a border pattern that looked almost like teeth. The third was in the best condition, though not the cleanest. A single red thread had been tied around its strap. That was the one Alexandra looked at the longest. She did not touch it. "Ben," she said softly, "what did you leave me?" The cabin did not answer. She went to the sink and washed her hands again. Cold water ran over her skin. She scrubbed until her knuckles reddened. But she still imagined the creature's blood beneath her nails, black threads curling away from light. When she looked out the kitchen window, darkness pressed against the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, tired, bruised, hair loose from its braid, eyes older than they had been that morning. Behind her reflection, the journals waited on the table. Alexandra turned away from the window. She made coffee because her hands needed something ordinary to do. The battered pot hissed on the stove. While it brewed, she took off her torn jacket and examined the claw marks across the back. 3 long slashes, deep enough to ruin the leather, not deep enough to touch her skin. Luck. Or restraint. That was worse. She hung the jacket over a chair and sat at the table across from the journals. Firelight moved over the leather covers, bringing out scars, grain, old oil, and shadow. The room beyond the table seemed to fall away. Everything in the cabin narrowed down to those 3 books. Alexandra wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and let the heat bite her palms. She remembered being 10 years old and asking Ben why he wrote everything down if he never let anyone read it. He had taken a long time to answer. Because one day someone may need the truth more than they need comfort. At 10 she had not understood. At 24, with bruised ribs and a creature's voice still crawling through her memory, she understood too well. Her eyes moved to the first journal. All she had to do was undo the buckle and open it. The thing from the barn might be inside those pages. The bell. The boundary marker. The warning by the creek. The meaning of hunger walking like a man. Maybe Ben had hunted one before. Maybe he had wounded it. Maybe the creature knew her name because it had known his. Or maybe opening those pages would destroy the last piece of her life that still felt normal. That was the truth she did not want to name. Once she opened Ben's journals, she could no longer pretend she was only protecting farms from a strange predator. She could no longer stand at the edge of his world and tell herself she had not stepped into it. She would not just inherit the cabin. She would inherit the burden. Alexandra looked toward the hearth. Above the mantel hung a photograph she had avoided since moving in. Ben, years younger, stood beside a much younger Alexandra near the creek. She was missing a front tooth and holding up a fish like a trophy. Ben was not smiling, not exactly, but his eyes were softer than usual. He had loved her. Not neatly. Not gently. Not in any way people would write poems about. But fiercely. Practically. He had taught her to survive because he knew survival was the only gift the world could not easily take back. Alexandra set her mug down and reached toward the nearest journal. Her fingers hovered above the leather. Then a sound came from outside. Not a howl. Not a branch breaking. Not footsteps on the porch. A bell. One soft ring from the edge of the clearing. Alexandra's hand froze. The fire snapped behind her. The whole cabin seemed to tighten, old wood, old wards, old secrets pulling close around her. Then the bell rang again. Closer. Alexandra stood slowly. The chair legs scraped across the floor. She picked up the shotgun and moved toward the window without stepping in front of it. The clearing was empty. Only mist. Darkness. Trees. On the wall beside the door, Ben's old hat moved slightly, as if touched by a draft that was not there. Alexandra looked back at the 3 journals. The red thread around the third volume seemed brighter in the firelight now. She did not open them. Not yet. Instead, she crossed to the hearth, took a burning piece of cedar with the iron tongs, and carried it to the door. Smoke curled through the room. With the shotgun tucked under one arm and flame in her other hand, she stood before the bolted door and listened. The bell outside gave one final soft ring. Then a voice, low and far away, moved through the dark beyond the cabin. "Carter." Alexandra's face hardened, but grief moved beneath it, raw and bright as the fire at her side. The creature had followed her to Ben's land. Or maybe it had been waiting for her to come home all along. She looked once more at the journals Ben Carter had left behind, and understood with cold certainty that the decision had already been made. She could wait until morning. She could drink her coffee. She could sit in the firelight and pretend the world outside the cabin had not changed. But the old trails were opening. And sooner or later, Alexandra Carter would have to read what Ben had died trying to leave her. Morning came gray and mean. Alexandra had slept only a few hours, and even those had been shallow. Dreams dragged her through Belle's yellow eyes and something breathing just outside the reach of firelight. Twice, she woke with her hand already reaching for the shotgun beside the bed. Once, just before dawn, she heard tapping beneath the cabin. 3 taps. Then silence. She sat upright, ribs aching, every breath caught behind her teeth. Nothing moved in the doorway. Nothing scratched the window. Then came 2 more taps, softer and deeper, as if something had knocked from inside the earth. By late morning, she had built the fire high, made coffee strong enough to bite, and carried the oldest journal to Ben's worn leather chair. Frost still silvered the grass outside. The woods were too quiet. No birds. No squirrel at the woodpile. No ordinary morning sounds to convince her the world had returned to sense. The shotgun leaned within reach. The journal rested on her lap. Alexandra opened it. The first pages were warnings, rules, signs, pack lists, Ben's hard-earned lessons written in a hand that looked carved rather than written. Never go alone if you can help it. Never follow a voice deeper than your light can reach. Never answer a sound from the dark just because it knows your name. Then the entries changed. The handwriting remained Ben's, but the layout became sharper. Headings, margins, notes added years later in darker ink. Small sketches in the corners. Some words circled. Others underlined twice. The first full case file stared up at her. The knocker. Mine spirit. Cornish miner's legend, but I have heard the sound myself. Other names: Tomic knocker, mine knocker, tunnel spirit. Category: Type 3 or Type 7. Disposition unclear. Threat level moderate to severe, depending on depth, greed, and whether it wants you warned or buried. Ben had drawn a hard box around the notes beneath. The lines were pressed so deeply into the paper that Alexandra could feel them on the other side of the page. It no longer read like folklore. It read like a file opened after too many bodies. Carter Journal Case File 001. Subject: The Knocker. Tomic knocker. My knocker. Tunnel spirit. First Carter encounter. Bellhaven Mine, Iron Ridge County. May 1943. Primary warning. Do not knock back. Do not ring a bell you did not hang. Do not follow a voice deeper than your light can reach. Common bait: greed. Panic. Trapped voices. Familiar names. Promise door. Guilt over the dead. The human need to prove fear wrong. Likely consequence if ignored: collapse. Disappearance. Madness. Repeated knocking in new ground. Attention carried home by the survivor. Current status in Ben Carter's hand. Not dead. Contained, angered, and possibly connected to other deep places. Alexandra read the last line twice. Attention carried home by the survivor. The words had no patience for comfort. They took hold of the cabin around her and turned every floorboard into a question. The tapping from before dawn returned to her mind. 3 taps. Then 2. She did not like that Ben's first case began with knocking. She liked even less that part of her still wanted to believe it was coincidence. The journal continued. Bellhaven Mine woke before dawn. Long before the sun broke over Iron Ridge County, smoke already leaned from the cookhouse chimney, mules stamped in their stalls, and men came down the road with lunch pails swinging from their hands. The mine sat in the shoulder of the ridge like a black wound braced open by timber. In daylight, with carts clattering and foremen shouting, a man could tell himself it was only work. Rock. Sweat. Oregon wages. That was what Bellhaven sold to the county. That was what the company clerk wrote in clean ink. The men who went below knew better. A mine was a throat, and every morning they walked into it hoping it would spit them out again by evening. Elias Creed and Jonah Bell were not fools, though later men would call them foolish because the living often insult the dead to feel safer. Elias was older by 6 years, broad-shouldered and quiet, with hands so scarred they looked carved from root wood. Jonah was younger, married only 8 months, still inclined to polish his boots on Sundays and still proud enough to believe he would save money instead of spending it all on rent, flour, lamp oil and the doctor. They had worked shaft 3 for 3 weeks, following a vein the company insisted was stable despite the way the old support beams groaned whenever the carts passed. The foreman, Harlan Voss, called the sound settling timber. The old driller, Orrin Pike, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and said the ridge had started talking again. Nobody liked when Pike spoke that way. He had a voice like gravel poured into a bucket and the unpleasant habit of being right after people laughed at him. He came from a Cornish mining family, though he had crossed enough country that his accent had worn thin in places. He left bread crusts on flat stones near bad passages. He never whistled underground. He would not enter shaft 4 after sundown, and he made a small mark with chalk near every turn even when the path was plain. Younger men mocked him until something went wrong. Then they watched Pike. They watched his hands. They watched his eyes. They watched his fear. That morning, Elias saw the first sign and did not know enough to name it. The mule refused the lower turn. She was a steady animal, gray-muzzled and patient, used to noise, darkness, bad air, and men with shorter tempers than brains. Yet at the mouth of the mule tunnel, she planted her hooves and leaned backward until the harness creaked. Jonah tugged once. Elias slapped the rope against his palm, not hard, just a warning. The mule did not move. Her ears flattened. Her sides shivered as if a winter wind had found her under the skin. "Leave her," Pike said from behind them. Foreman Voss turned. "She is a mule, not a prophet." "Mules do not need prophecy to smell a grave," Pike said. Voss told them to take the handcart instead. There was or to inspect near the crosscut passage between shaft 3 and shaft 4, and the company did not pay men to stand in a hole arguing with animals. Elias hesitated. Jonah looked at the mule, then at the foreman, then at the black turn ahead. The mine air was colder there. Not the ordinary damp chill of underground places, but something sharper. It touched Jonah's face like a wet cloth and made him rub his arms. They went in because wages taught men obedience. The track bent through the mule tunnel and narrowed. Timber leaned overhead, old but not rotten enough to give a man permission to refuse. Water dripped from the left wall. Their lantern flame burned yellow at first, steady and honest, throwing Elias's shadow long in front of him and Jonah's shorter shadow behind. They passed the chalk mark Pike had made 2 days earlier. Jonah noticed it had been smeared. Not by water. Downward. 5 thin streaks, as if fingers had dragged through the white dust. "Did you do that?" Jonah asked. Elias looked back. "Do what?" Jonah decided not to answer. Some questions sounded foolish once spoken underground. The first knock came when they reached the crosscut. 3 clean taps from the wall to their right. Not the tick of cooling metal. Not the crack of timber. Not loose stone. A deliberate sound, knuckle hard, placed inside the rock. Elias stopped so suddenly Jonah bumped into him. Their lantern threw light across the wall. Nothing moved. The passage ahead sloped toward shaft 4, older, darker, and partly collapsed according to the map. The passage to the left dropped toward lower levels that flooded in spring. Behind them lay the mule tunnel. Behind them lay the way out. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Jonah swallowed. "That Pike." Elias lifted the lantern. The light shook only a little. "Pike is behind us." 2 more taps came from deeper in the crosscut. That was the sound Jonah would remember for the rest of his life, because it did not echo away. It seemed to travel through the stone and settle in his chest. Elias stared down the passage toward shaft 4. There were stories about shaft 4. Every mine had stories, but these had weight. Men taken there in 1943 and found 6 days later with their tools arranged beside them. A rescue crew that heard tapping behind a sealed wall and dug for hours, only to break into solid rock. Bread disappearing from lunch pails. Lanterns going blue in one stretch of tunnel no matter how fresh the air seemed. "We go back," Jonah said. Elias did not answer. He had seen something on the floor. A scatter of fresh stones lay across the track ahead, still wet where they had broken from the wall. Beyond them, the vein showed dull and pale in the lantern glow. Ore. Good ore. Maybe rich enough to earn praise, bonus pay, and another month of steady work. Elias took one step forward. The knocking answered. Not from ahead this time. From above. Dust fell into Jonah's hair. "Elias," he said. That was when the lantern flame leaned blue. Men later asked Jonah why he did not run then. He never had a good answer. Fear does not always make a man fast. Sometimes it nails his boots to the earth and makes him watch as the world chooses a shape for his terror. He remembered Elias lifting the lantern higher. He remembered the blue flame thinning until the glass looked full of drowned light. He remembered a sound from behind the wall, not knocking now but scratching. Long. Patient. As if someone with too many fingers dragged nails along stone. Then a voice came from the wall. "Jonah." Sounded like his wife. He dropped the handcart handle. Elias cursed and grabbed him, but Jonah was already stumbling backward. The wall ahead cracked with a dry sound. Not a collapse yet. A warning. Elias shoved him toward the mule tunnel. That was what saved him. The roof gave way in pieces rather than all at once. Beams popped. Stones fell. Dust bloomed thick as smoke. Jonah hit the ground and crawled, choking, hands tearing open against rock and rail. Elias's lantern vanished behind a curtain of gray. For one heartbeat, Jonah saw a shape through the dust near the right wall. Small. Bent. Too low to be a man. Too wide in the head. One hand pressed against the stone. Its eyes caught the dying light like wet metal. Then Elias screamed. Jonah crawled toward the scream. He did. That mattered to him later. Whatever men said, whatever cowardice he carried, he crawled toward his friend until something tapped once beside his ear from inside the floor. The sound froze him. The dust shifted. In the dark ahead, Elias screamed again. Then the scream cut off so cleanly Jonah knew no stone had smothered it. Something had placed a hand over his mouth. Jonah ran then. Crawled, stumbled, bled, and ran. Behind him, from inside the mountain, 3 taps followed. A pause. 2 more. Counting. By the time he reached daylight, his hands were torn open and his face was the color of ash. He fell in the yard at Pike's feet, clutching the old driller's trouser leg like a child. "It took him," Jonah said. "The wall opened and it took him." Pike crouched slowly, his face gone hard and old. From the mine mouth behind them came one soft knock. Alexandra stopped reading. The fire cracked at her feet, sudden and loud enough to make her flinch. Outside the cabin, the clearing remained empty. Frost glittered in the thin daylight. The trees stood still. Nothing moved between the trunks. But the cabin no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a mine with walls made of wood. Alexandra looked down at Ben's journal again, at the hard black warning boxed beneath the title. "Do not knock back." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the page. Then something answered from beneath the floorboards. Tap, tap, tap. Alexandra went still. The sound had not come from the roof. Not the porch. Not the walls. Beneath. The fire snapped again. The shotgun waited beside her chair. She did not move. She did not speak. And she did not knock back.